Once upon a time, under the soft glow of moonlight, we begin our gentle journey together. Let the worries of the day drift away as I tell you a story from long ago. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable jewels and questionable survival instincts of some of the most absurdly intense one-on-one fights in medieval history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you've ever waited 6 months for a reply from customer service, imagine waiting 2 years for a king to approve your jewel to the death request. Welcome to France in the 1380s, where justice moved slowly but involved significantly more stabbing. Juge was your classic medieval knight, proud, angry, and just a bit obsessed with inheritance disputes. His wife, Marguerite, accused another knight, Jack Ree, of raping her while Jean was off, doing knight things, which mostly involved either riding in circles or suing his neighbors. Cares naturally believed her. Ree naturally denied everything. Since medieval courts were about as reliable as a weather forecast from a goat, the judges threw up their hands and said, "Let God decide," by which they meant, let the 2 men put on full armor, charge each other with lances, and see who dies first. The duel took place in December 1386 in front of King Charles V's 6th, Queen Isabel, and a crowd of thousands who showed up to watch justice be served like it was WrestleMania. Oh, and Marguerite. She sat in the Sèvres and Taplangs, stands on a wooden scaffold tied to a chair. If her husband lost, she'd be burned alive for false accusation. No pressure. The fight was brutal. They started with lances, both shattered, then swords, then axes. At one point, Carriages was knocked to the ground, but managed to rally, tackle Ree, and drive a dagger through his neck while yelling something appropriately dramatic. Crowd went wild. Justice was served. Marguerite got to live, and France collectively decided, you know what? Maybe we should stop doing this. It was the last sanctioned trial by combat in France, which is a shame, really, because it had excellent spectator value and far fewer commercials than modern legal dramas. As for Cujas, he became a national celebrity. As for Lee, he remained very, very dead. Although centuries later, some historians would suggest he might have been innocent, which just goes to show in medieval France, truth was a distant second to theatrics, and God had a strangely high tolerance for judicial blood sport. Moral of the story, if you're ever in legal trouble, maybe don't ask the king for sword-based arbitration, unless you're really good with a dagger. Godfrey of Bouillon was the kind of man who heard the phrase, "take up the cross," and decided it meant also taking up a very large sword and developing a personal rivalry with gravity. As one of the leading commanders of the First Crusade, Godfrey was famously devout, deeply committed to reclaiming Jerusalem, and crucially built like a siege tower. He didn't just fight for Christendom, he bodied for it. But even in a war full of religious zealots and overcooked chain mail, one fight stood out. Godfrey vs. the giant Tsar. The tale is part history, part testosterone-soaked legend. While marching through the Levant, Godfrey reportedly found himself face to face with a towering Muslim warrior, a local champion sent to intimidate the Frankish invaders. The man was said to be over 7 feet tall and armored like a walking fortress. Naturally, the two agreed to settle the matter of whose god is better with good old-fashioned ultraviolence. No armies, no strategies, just 2 men, 1 sword each, and a mutual lack of concern for their kneecaps. According to the chroniclers, whose accuracy is debatable but whose flair for drama is not, the duel was brutal and short. Godfrey, charged, took a heavy blow that would have turned a lesser knight into a pancake, and then in true crusader fashion, responded by slicing the giant clean in half vertically. Yes, vertically, like a medieval fruit ninja. Now, whether this is anatomically or physically possible depends on your opinion of physics, and how bored medieval monks were when writing battle reports. Either way, the story spread like wildfire. God had apparently picked his favorite again. This duel cemented Godfrey's reputation as the holy heavyweight of the Crusades. He went on to become defender of the holy, sealer in Jerusalem, refusing the Perdinger's the 5x25.org title of king because he didn't want to wear a crown where Christ wore thorns. But he was perfectly fine cleaving opponents in half like firewood, which really tells you everything about medieval piety. Moral of the story. In the Middle Ages, religious diplomacy often involved fewer sermons and more sword-based interpretive dance. And if you're ever challenged by someone described as a giant, maybe check if your opponent has a biblical nickname before accepting. Richard the Lionhead. Hart wasn't known for his subtlety. He was known for storming castles, composing war poetry seriously, and killing people with a kind of cheerful efficiency that made even other crusaders slightly uncomfortable. But among his many dramatic moments during the Third Crusade, one particularly theatrical 1v1 stands out: his duel with Saladin's champion. Now, a few disclaimers. First, this wasn't a barroom brawl between Richard and Saladin themselves, which is a pity because that would have broken YouTube in the year 1191. Instead, This was a high-profile bout arranged between Richard and one of Saladin's finest warriors. Name lost to history, unfortunately, but let's just call him the guy who had a very bad day. The duel was part of a medieval tradition where opposing commanders occasionally agreed to a champion fight. Not to end the war, of course. Don't be silly. This was more of a flex, a medieval talent show with fewer violins and more bladed weapons. So the Saris warrior rode out, armored and gleaming, ready to impress his sultan and god alike. Richard, of course, showed up, like it was opening night at the Crusader Theater, mounted resplendent, in chainmail, sword practically humming with righteous arrogance. They circled, they clashed, and in mere moments, Richard reportedly sliced clean through the man's shield and armor, nearly down to the saddle. Eyewitnesses gasped, the Saris blinked, and Richard, just to be extra dramatic, then chopped through an iron bar with the same sword to prove it wasn't a fluke, because apparently one kill wasn't enough. The sword needed a solo. Saladin, watching from afar, was said to be impressed in that quiet note to self, "Don't duel this man" sort of way. He even responded with his own bit of flair days later, sending Richard Snow from Mount Lebanon to cool his fever. War was war, but a little passive, aggressive hospitality never hurt. Did this fight change the outcome of the crusade? Absolutely not. Did it give Richard's legend a boost? Without question. And in a time when battlefield selfies weren't an option, this was the next best thing. Sometimes history doesn't give us a grand duel with speeches, orchestras, or dragons. Sometimes it just gives us a Scottish king who's mildly annoyed, and a knight who made one very poor decision. It was June 23rd, 1314, the day before the Battle of Bannockburn, the medieval equivalent of the Super Bowl, but with more mud and fewer commercials. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots and part-time survivalist, was out scouting the battlefield on a small horse. Not a warrior, mind you, but the medieval version of a compact sedan, just trotting around, minding his own rebellion. Enter Henry Dehan, an English knight and proud owner of an entry, ego the size of Westminster Abbey. From across the field, he spotted Bruce, alone, unarmored, and apparently not interested in being dramatically murdered. To Henry, this looked like divine opportunity, a chance to single-handedly end the Scottish rebellion and look amazing doing it. So Henry did what any overconfident aristocrat would do. He lowered his lance and charged full speed at a king. No backup, no second opinion, just vibes. Robert the Bruce saw this happening, and according to every source did not panic. He didn't call for help. He didn't even dismount. He simply waited, calmly, probably a bit insulted. At the last possible moment, Bruce stood in the stirrups, guided his smaller horse slightly to the side, and obliterated Henry DeHaan's skull with a single axe swing. One hit, instant correction. The kind of head trauma that ends both a duel and your entire genealogical line. The axe split not just Henry's helmet, but also the handle, which annoyed Bruce more than the whole, nearly being killed thing. Later, when his men congratulated him on the epic kill, Bruce reportedly grumbled about breaking his favorite weapon. Priorities. This wasn't just a flashy moment. It demoralized the English, emboldened the Scots, and gave Robert the Bruce the kind of campaign poster no modern politician could dream of. Vote for Bruce. He's not dead yet. The Middle Ages were, among other things, a period in which legal systems occasionally said, "You know what? Let's just fight about it." Hence the concept of the judicial duel, where two parties settled serious accusations not with lawyers, but with maces. And in 13th to 15th century Germany, this glorious logic reached its peak with the husband versus wife pit duel. Yes, a man and woman fighting in a hole. Here's how it worked. If a wife accused her husband of serious misconduct or vice versa, and both parties insisted on a trial by combat, a special duel was arranged. But not on equal terms. Of course, if you ever travel back in time and end up in a duel, remember, skill matters. But a completely unhinged first impression might win the psychological war before swords even cross. Before medieval tournaments were sanitized into jousts with polite clapping and overpriced turkey legs, they were glorious, chaotic bloodbaths called melees, and no one thrived in the swirling mess of clanging steel, crushed egos, and unregulated violence. Quite like William Marshall, born around 1146, William was the son of a minor noble, and like any second son, with no inheritance and lots of biceps, he turned to knighthood, but not the courtly, flower-niffing kind. William went full berserker, earning fame in melee tournaments, which at the time were basically large-scale one-of-ons with dozens of participants, no teams, and the goal of either capturing your opponent or beating them until they gave you money to stop. Marshall's tactic: charge into the chaos like a human battering ram. If elegance was a sword stroke, he missed it entirely. But his record, ridiculous. In one season, he reportedly unhorsed 500 knights. That's not a duel. That's a medieval hitman. Resume. He became so terrifying that nobles would literally try to avoid being in the same melee as him. Ah, William's here. Sorry. I remembered I left my chainmail in the crowd. Bath. His horse was trampled so often tournament officials had to start giving him replacement horses as prizes. At some point he stopped counting, and the man was chivalrous too, at least by medieval standards. Once he knocked a guy off his horse, helped him up, then robbed him. Anyway, chivalry. Eventually, William's melee rampage made him rich and respected. He rose through the ranks, became an advisor to kings, and served 5 English monarchs without being murdered even once, which, given the Plantagenet track record, is its own miracle. In old age, well into his 70s, he was still strapping on armor and leading troops. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, he personally charged into enemy lines, like he was still 30, and came out without a scratch, which means either he was divinely protected, or everyone else was too scared to hit him. When he finally died, they buried him at the Temple Church in London, where his tomb still quietly flexes to this day. Monks, peaceful, devout, bold, known for making beer and illuminating manuscripts. But occasionally, in the grand tradition of passive, aggressively smiting one another in the name of Christ, they got just a little bit stabby. Let's travel to the wild ecclesiastical frontier of 11th century France, where a bizarre footnote in monastic history occurred. A trial by combat between 2 monks. Yes, actual monks, not knights who retired into prayer robes. Actual monks who normally wouldn't hurt a fly unless it buzzed during Vespers. The source, as foggy as a medieval morning, mentions a legal dispute between 2 Benedictine brothers, possibly over land, heresy, or who got to sing lead during matins, in the absence of an agreeable bishop. The matter was escalated to a sword fight because nothing says turn the other cheek like pulling out a broadsword and swinging for the toner. Eyewitnesses claimed the duel was conducted according to the sacred rites of both canon law and general lunacy. One monk, let's call him Brother Odo, was reportedly small, wiry, and quick on his feet. The other, Brother Hugo, was more rotunded and chose the intimidating tactic of glowering with righteous indignation. Both were robed. Neither, it seems, had combat training beyond possibly fighting over soup ladles in the cloister kitchen. They met in a courtyard with a preaser, few unfortunate pigeons watching from the rafters. Blows were exchanged. Sandals were lost. Habits were torn. One monk landed a hit with what was either a blessed staff or just a glorified walking stick. The other responded by tackling him into a trough. Eventually, one monk emerged victorious, barely breathing and covered in both bruises and theological shame. Justice apparently had been served. This event was so profoundly ridiculous that the church immediately cracked down on it. Trial by combat was already controversial, but monk on. Monk dueling was a bridge too far. Canon law was tightened. Future monk fights were relegated to stern glances and side eyes over dinner. You know, a civilization has really committed to the chaos of medieval justice when two grown men in armor decide to settle a cheese-related dispute with a jewel. Welcome to 12th century Denmark, where the dairy flowed like wine and tempers were only slightly cooler than curdling milk. The details come to us from a local chronicle now, mostly lost to time, and probably mice. But the tale is simple. Two Danish nobles, let's call them Lord Knud and Sir Sven, could not agree on who owned a particularly fertile pasture or the cheese produced therein. Yes, cheese. Not land, not honor, cheese. In theory, they could have mediated the dispute over a flag of me, like reasonable men. But this was medieval Denmark, where arbitration often involved swords, yelling, and a very poor understanding of consequences. Witnesses say the duel was arranged in a clearing just outside Roskilde. The weapons were broadswords, the stakes, ownership of a small herd of goats, several wheels of soft, heavenly cheese, and crucially, the right to be the man who won a duel over cheese for the rest of his life. Lord Kenneth was a large, sweaty noble with the upper body of a Viking and the footwork of a sack of barley. Servan, smaller and wearier, was a known cheese enthusiast, which some say gave him the psychological seize edge, or perhaps he was just angry someone had touched his brie. The duel lasted longer than expected. Both men shouted accusations about curd theft and lactose-related heresy. At one point, Knud slipped on a wheel of cheese because, yes, someone brought them to the field for dramatic flair and nearly impaled himself on his own sword. In the end, Sven managed to land a clumsy but decisive blow to Knud's leg, sending him sprawling. He demanded satisfaction and the cheese, which he received, along with mild fame in local ballads that rhyme bravery with dairy. The church, predictably horrified, tried to outlaw such nonsense shortly after, but the damage had been done. Cheese dueling entered Danish legend. Of all the weapons forged in medieval Europe, few were as underappreciated as the humble frying pan. Designed for eggs, not executions, it rarely made it onto the battlefield, except once, in the case of one supremely annoyed French knight who turned cookware into carnage. The tale comes from a 13th century tavern account, hardly official, but delightfully absurd. Our hero, Sir Guam de Fer, was not your typical paragon of chivalry. He was a minor knight, land poor, debt rich, and extremely passionate about two things: his honor and his breakfast. One morning, while visiting a roadside inn near Toulouse, Sergom found himself in a heated argument with another knight, a smug noble named Raoul Deseron, who allegedly insulted his cooking and implied his bacon was unworthy of nobility. This was not just culinary criticism, it was social annihilation. A duel was demanded. Now this wasn't a battlefield or a tournament. It was a tavern kitchen, and so Guillaume didn't have his sword, but he did have a cast iron skillet, still sizzling with the righteous fury of eggs recently cooked. Raoul, meanwhile, had a dagger and zero sense of humor. Eyewitnesses claimed the fight was short, but spectacular. Sir Guillaume swung the pan like a flanged mace, knocking over chairs, splattering grease, and delivering a clanging uppercut that reportedly rang like a cathedral bell. Raoul attempted a parry and got slapped across the helm by half an omelet. The duel ended with Raoul unconscious in a pile of ash and onions. Guillaume declared victory, flipped the pan in triumph, and finished cooking his breakfast. Some say the innkeeper gave him free meals for life. Others say the church issued a quiet reprimand for turning kitchens into arenas of judgment. Regardless, the frying pan duel of Toulouse became legend. Knights retold it for years, usually after a few drinks, and with exaggerated choreography involving bacon shields and egg-based parries. Not all medieval duels ended in a spray of arterial drama and victorious monologues. Some bafflingly ended in emotions, unplanned ones. Case in point, the bizarre and vaguely heartwarming 14th century duel between two knights who began as bitter enemies and ended well sort of cuddling. The story takes place during the 100 Years' War, which, contrary to its name, was less a continuous war and more of a long, toxic, on-again, off-again relationship between England and France. Amidst this emotional battlefield, two knights, Sir Thomas Dales of England and Jean Le Boutier of Brittany, found themselves caught in a heated argument over prisoner exchanges, ransom etiquette, and whose mother wore more armor. A duel was arranged because, again, talking things out hadn't been invented yet. Witnesses say the knights clashed with gusto. There were lances, swords, and just enough chivalric flair to make the French poet swoon. But after several minutes of sweaty grappling, each man realized something crucial. They were completely exhausted, and probably too evenly matched to kill each other without risking cardiac arrest. Then came the moment. Locked in a clench, panting through their helmets like wheezing goats, one of them, possibly John, reportedly muttered something like, "Are we done?" Sir Thomas, never one for poetry, allegedly grunted, "Only if you are." And that was it. They backed off, both bleeding slightly, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. A truce was declared. Some accounts even say they shook hands. One source, likely exaggerated by a minstrel on mushrooms, insists they embraced, removed their helmets, and laughed about the futility of war, while the crowd, awkwardly, but these weren't mere decorations, They were symbols carefully chosen to broadcast meaning, rank, and allegiance. Pearls held a special place in Elizabeth and culture. They were the jewels of the sea, expensive to import and time-consuming to harvest. To wear pearls was to flaunt one's ability to buy rarity itself. Queen Elizabeth made pearls her personal emblem. She wore them by the hundreds, strung in ropes around her neck, sewn into her gowns, dangling from her hair, and even embroidered into her shoes. Their milky sheen symbolized purity, reinforcing her cultivated image as the Virgin Queen. Portraits show her almost drowning in pearls, as if purity itself had taken physical form and clothed her body. For her courtiers, wearing pearls was not just fashion, but political theater. To echo the Queen's jewel of choice was to echo her virtue. Embroidery served a similar function, but with even more versatility. A gown might feature stitched roses to honor the Tudor dynasty, pomegranates for fertility, or suns and moons to symbolize constancy. Skilled artisans spent months turning garments into coded texts of loyalty and ambition. Wealthy families hired entire teams of embroiderers to adorn sleeves and bodices with metallic thread, creating wearable propaganda. To walk into court with a gown glittering in gold was not merely to appear fashionable. It was to declare power, stitched into every seam. The cost was staggering. A heavily embroidered gown could equal the price of a London townhouse. Pearls alone were worth fortunes, and their weight on a dress made even standing upright a challenge. But Elizabeth and courtiers endured the discomfort gladly. Every glittering stitch was a declaration. I belong here among the powerful. In this way, Elizabeth and fashion was never silent. It spoke through gems, thread, shimmer. It told stories of chastity, loyalty, and ambition. To dress richly was to write yourself into the Queen's theater of power, a stage where clothing was not vanity, but a weapon. When we picture Elizabeth and fashion, it is easy to imagine only the towering gowns and pearl-encrusted collars of the Queen's ladies. Yet, men at court were no less flamboyant in their pursuit of style. In fact, Elizabeth and men turned dressing into an art of dominance, using doublets, hose, and slashed sleeves to broadcast power, virility, and allegiance to the crown. The male silhouette of the time was padded and exaggerated. The centerpiece was the doublet, a snug, tailored jacket that extended down to the waist, stiffened with padding to project a broad chest and narrow torso. Underneath, men wore shirts with embroidered collars that peaked above the doublet's neckline, often finished with a small ruff. Some courtiers even stuffed their doublets with bombast, a kind of weighting to give the illusion of muscular strength. Looking strong was just as important as being strong. And in the politics of the Elizabethan court, image was everything. breeches or hose completed the look. Early in the reign, they were tight-fitting, but as the decades passed, they ballooned outward into trunk hose, short padded, shorts that puffed extravagantly around the hips. To modernize, they look almost comical, but at the time, they symbolized masculine, confidence, and aristocratic leisure. These were clothes that made riding, dueling, or dancing look heroic, and they required constant tailoring to maintain their puffed perfection. Then there were the sleeves. Elizabeth and men adored slashed and paned sleeves, where outer fabric was cut to reveal the fine silk or satin beneath. This layering was a deliberate show of wealth. Why own one luxurious fabric when you could show off two at once? Bright colors, scarlet, saffron, and deep blue further heightened the spectacle, while jewels and gold embroidery elevated noblemen above the rest. Accessories were equally important. Men wore jeweled hats with tall feathers, carried ornate swords with gilded hilts, and adorned themselves with rings and chains heavy enough to dent a table. These were not frivolities, but markers of allegiance. To glitter at court was to show you had the Queen's favor, or at least the resources to pretend. Elizabeth and men, like their female counterparts, were trapped in a theater of appearances. Every puffed sleeve and padded chest was a performance. Each detail a declaration of loyalty, wealth, and masculinity. The men of Elizabeth's court dressed not just to impress, but to survive in a world where power was stitched, padded, and slashed into silk. If the gown or doublet was the body of Elizabeth and fashion, then shoes, accessories, and cosmetics were the finishing touches that transformed courtiers into living works of art. In a world where appearances were political statements, no detail was too small to overlook. The flick of a feather in a cap or the tint of a cheek could signal loyalty, wealth, or scandal. Shoes in Elizabeth and England were often surprisingly simple in shape, but no less extravagant in material. Men favored square-toed slippers made from velvet or leather, sometimes decorated with rosettes or embroidery. Women's shoes were similarly low, heeled, designed more for show than for practicality. Since skirts often brushed the ground, ladies' footwear rarely had the chance to dazzle, but fine materials and hidden embroidery marked status even where few could see it. For both sexes, shoes symbolized refinement. Practical boots were for the working classes. Accessories, however, where the real competition began. Hats were essential, especially for men. Courtiers strutted through the palace in felt caps or tall crowns adorned with feathers, imported from exotic lands. A single plume from an ostrich or peacock was more than decoration. It was a signal of wealth and connections abroad. Chains of office made of gold and hung heavy around the neck carried political meaning. They marked rank, and the queen's favor. Even gloves, often perfumed and embroidered, became fashionable tokens, exchanged as gifts to secure alliances or flirtations. Cosmetics were equally charged with meaning. Women and, occasionally, men painted their faces with a stark white foundation made of soos, a mixture of vinegar and white lead. It created the desired pale complexion that spoke of aristocratic leisure far removed from the sunburnt skin of peasants. Rouge tinted the cheeks, while vermilion brightened the lips. Some even darkened their eyebrows with soot or coal dust, framing the face like a living portrait. Of course, these concoctions were often poisonous, slowly damaging the skin, but vanity outweighed health in the theater of Elizabeth and fashion. Perfume completed the ensemble. Imported from Italy or France, it masked the odor of rarely washed bodies and garments, while also signaling sophistication. A whiff of rose water or musk could distinguish a courtier from the crowd. Taken together, shoes, feathers, gloves, paint, and perfume were not trivial additions, but vital props in the ongoing performance of power. In Elizabeth's court, every inch of the body was curated, polished, and staged. Fashion was total theater, and the smallest accessory could tip the balance between favor and disgrace. No one understood the power of clothing better than Elizabeth I, while her courtiers scrambled to keep up with the shifting trends of ruffs, pearls, and embroidery. The queen set the tone for the entire kingdom. She was not simply fashionable, she was fashion itself, the living standard by which all others were judged. Every detail of her wardrobe was carefully orchestrated, transforming her body into a political canvas and her image into propaganda. Elizabeth's portraits revealed this strategy in vivid detail. She rarely appeared in anything less than overwhelming splendor. Her gowns were mountains of brocade and velvet, stiffened with gold thread and glittering with pearls. Her collars framed her head like halos, while her skirts flared outward in massive farthingales that turned her into a moving edifice. These weren't clothes meant for comfort. They were costumes of majesty, designed to dwarf, intimidate, and inspire. Pearls became her personal signature. By drowning herself in them, Elizabeth cultivated the persona of the Virgin Queen. Purity and chastity shimmered from every gown, yet the sheer volume of pearls also shouted wealth and dominance. No one else could afford such excess, and even if they could, none dared to rival her display. Her use of color was equally symbolic. White and gold suggested purity and divinity, while black projected authority, restraint, and power. In portraits such as the Armada portrait, she appears draped in white and silver, one hand resting on a globe, her wardrobe merging personal virtue with imperial ambition. But Elizabeth's clothing was more than just theater. It was control. She famously bestowed cast-off gowns to favored ladies in waiting, a calculated move that turned clothing into a currency of favor. At the same time, she punished those who dared to imitate her too closely. Courtiers walked a fine line, dress richly enough to honor her court, but never so splendidly as to compete with the queen herself. Through fashion, Elizabeth projected not just beauty, but near divinity. She transformed her frail mortal body into an immortal icon, commanding loyalty and awe through silk, jewels, and paint. When she entered a chamber, it was less a woman who arrived than a myth in motion. In the Elizabeth and court, the Virgin Queen did not simply rule. She dazzled, and in dazzling, she conquered. While Elizabeth and her courtiers shimmered in gold-threaded velvets and gowns heavy with pearls, the vast majority of England's people lived in a world of wool, leather, and linen. Fashion was not a universal playground, but a wall that separated the privileged few from everyone else. Clothing became a daily reminder of hierarchy, stitched visib. Wealthier women might wear beads of these stones strung around the neck or sewn into their clothing, while poorer women used polished pebbles, bones, or bits of iron in hopes of achieving the same effect. Iron especially was believed to terrify supernatural beings. A simple iron key tied to the belt or placed beneath the bed could serve as a protective weapon against witches and fairies said to steal or curse unborn children. Written charms were equally common. Short prayers, biblical verses, or magical words were copied onto slips of parchment, folded and worn in a small pouch around the neck or belly. Some contained the names of saints like Margaret or Mary, while others invoked Christ's wounds or obscure Latin phrases that blurred the line between religion and folk magic. To wear such a charm was to carry a piece of sacred power directly against the skin. Animal parts, too, found their place in this system of belief. The tooth of a wolf was thought to prevent premature labor, while a hare's foot, later famous as a good luck charm, was sometimes used to protect against miscarriage. Even feathers, shells, and dried herbs could be bound into amulets, each with its own meaning in the tapestry of superstition. For medieval women, these objects were more than trinkets. They were lifelines. In a world where medical knowledge was limited and childbirth was dangerous, amulets provided a sense of control, something physical to cling to when prayers alone seemed too distant. Whether blessed by a priest or whispered over by a village-wise woman, amulets bridged the gap between faith and fear. To step into pregnancy without them would have felt reckless. With them, a woman could at least believe she was guarded, her body armored not in steel, but in symbols. In the Middle Ages, what a pregnant woman ate was believed to shape not just her health, but the very body and soul of her child. medieval medical texts, sermons, and folk sayings all carried stern warnings about forbidden foods that could twist fate within the womb, while hunger and cravings were seen as natural. Indulging them too freely was thought to invite disaster. One common fear was that eating certain animals might imprint their qualities onto the unborn. Rabbits, for example, were to be avoided. Their reputation for timidity sparked the belief that a child born from a rabbit-fed mother might be weak or cowardly. Similarly, eels, slippery, and serpentine were shunned for fear they could cause deformities or illness in the child. Pork and other heavy meats were considered dangerous as well, blamed for difficult births or for producing sluggish, unhealthy infants fresh. Fruit, too, was sometimes suspect. Medieval people worried that eating unripe or sour fruit could sour the womb itself, leading to miscarriage or sickly babies. Grapes and apples might be allowed in moderation, but only if they were ripe, and often only if blessed. In contrast, certain foods were recommended for building strength. Almonds, honey, and carefully prepared grains were thought to nourish both mother and child with purity and balance. Cravings, however, carried their own risks. Medieval law held that if a pregnant woman's craving went unsatisfied, the frustration could mark the baby physically. Birthmarks, strange blemishes, or even deformities were explained as the result of denied desires. If a woman longed for strawberries and was refused, people feared the child might be born with a red stain upon the skin. Fulfilling a craving wasn't just kindness, it was preventative medicine. Husbands and families were often pressured to indulge these whims, believing that failure could scar the child for life. Fasting days, imposed by the church, complicated matters further. Pregnant women were sometimes exempted, but piety often dictated restraint. Breaking the fast could weigh heavily on a woman's conscience as she worried whether her disobedience might bring harm to her child. Thus, diet became a negotiation between faith, superstition, and survival. For expectant mothers, every bite carried meaning. Food was never simply nourishment. It was moral, spiritual, and magical. To eat wisely was to guard the womb. To eat wrongly was to risk bringing forth not a healthy child, but a living warning of broken rules. For medieval people, the sky was not distant and indifferent. It was alive with forces that shaped human fate. Stars guided crops, comets heralded disaster, and for expectant mothers, the heavens could be both guardian and threat. Pregnancy was thought to be especially vulnerable to celestial influence, and none was more feared than the lunar eclipse. An eclipse when the moon darkened or turned blood red was believed to interfere with the fragile balance of life inside the womb. Pregnant women were warned that if they exposed themselves to its light, their children might be born disfigured, stillborn, or cursed with monstrous traits. To shield against this, families often hurried expectant mothers indoors, shuttering windows and covering mirrors so the malign glow could not touch them. Amulets, keys of iron, knives, or consecrated herbs might be tied to the woman's waist or bed as further protection. Some even urged women to carry sharp objects during eclipses, believing the blad's power could cut through the danger of celestial interference. The moon in its ordinary phases also played a role. Astrological handbooks claim that conception and birth were safest under certain signs of the zodiac, while others predicted misfortune. A child born under Saturn's influence might be melancholic and ill-starred, while one aligned with Jupiter could be strong and fortunate. Astrologers were sometimes consulted to calculate the best times for conception or to predict the child's destiny, blending superstition with what passed for medieval science. Solar eclipses, too, carried their own dread. Though rarer, they were seen as ominous signs that threatened not just pregnancies, but kingdoms. Chroniclers sometimes connected them with waves of stillbirths or maternal deaths, feeding the belief that the sun itself could curse the womb. Even ordinary stargazing came with warnings. Looking too long at the night sky, some claimed, could draw in spirits or planetary influences that unsettled the child in the womb. Expectant mothers were advised to keep their eyes lowered and their nights quiet, protecting both themselves and their unborn children from unseen cosmic powers. In a world where childbirth already carried immense risk, the heavens added another layer of fear. The stars and moon could not be controlled, but with prayers, amulets, and vigilance, families hoped to shield mothers from the sky's mysterious wrath. If celestial forces threatened pregnancies from above, witches and malevolent neighbors were believed to endanger them from much closer to home. The Middle Ages were steeped in fear of magic, and few areas of life seemed as vulnerable to curses as the delicate state of pregnancy. A whispered word, a hostile glance, or an envious thought could. People believed doom, both mother and child. The most dreaded of these dangers was the evil eye. This superstition held that envy itself carried destructive power. If a pregnant woman drew the gaze of someone jealous, whether a barren neighbor, a resentful relative, or a passing stranger, the child in her womb might wither, deform, or die. To guard against this invisible threat, women wore protective charms, rings etched with holy names, pouches filled with salt or herbs, or even pieces of iron pinned to their clothing. Some carried blessed candles or sprinkled holy water before entering public spaces, hoping to deflect ill intentions. Witches, too, were feared as active agents of harm. Folklore warned that they could steal unborn children by supernatural means, drawing life from the womb for their own dark purposes. Tales circulated of women who miscarried after quarrels with suspected witches, fueling suspicion and sometimes violence. Midwives themselves often fell under scrutiny, for their deep knowledge of herbs and birth could look uncomfortably close to sorcery. In suspicious eyes, to ward off such dangers, ritual precautions were taken. Holy relics, tiny splinters of wood, fragments of saints' bones, or strips of cloth blessed at shrines were tied around the body as spiritual armor. Psalms were recited at the bedside, especially during the vulnerable hours of labor to drive away any lurking spirits. Some communities even hung protective objects above the doorway. Horseshoes, crosses, or bunches of herbs to keep witches from entering the birthing chamber. But not all countermeasures were sacred. Folk healers offered magical counterspells, advising women to carry wolf teeth, tie knots in red thread, or spit 3 times to repel the curse. Blending Christianity with folk tradition, these practices reflected the desperate desire for control in an unpredictable world. For medieval women, pregnancy was already a perilous journey. The fear that human malice, as much as divine judgment or cosmic influence, could twist fate, made vigilance constant. Whether through relics, charms, or whispered prayers, the womb was defended as a sacred frontier forever, at risk from both the jealous and the damned. When the first pangs of labor struck, a medieval woman was ushered into a world of ritual as much as medicine. The birthing chamber was transformed into a sacred and magical space where every word and object carried symbolic weight. Here, amid candlelight and whispered prayers, religion and superstition blended into a tapestry of hope against the very real dangers of childbirth. One of the most common rituals was the recitation of protective prayers. Psalms were chanted aloud, invoking divine mercy, while special blessings from saints, especially Saint Margaret of Antioch, were spoken over the mother. In some regions, her vita or life story was Medieval Christians inherited this framework, blending it with their own theology to create a ceremony that echoed these ancient laws while adapting them to Christian practice. Symbolism draped every element of the church in rite. The number 40 itself carried powerful meaning. Just as Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, Christ fasted for 40 days in the percent wilderness. So too did the postpartum mother wait 40 days before her ritual return. It was a period of trial, liminality, and preparation for renewal. The 40-day wait emphasized that her body and spirit needed cleansing before she could rejoin the spiritual community. The most potent biblical model, however, came from the Virgin Mary. According to the Gospel of Luke, Mary herself submitted to purification 40 days after Jesus' birth, presenting him at the temple in Jerusalem. If even the Mother of God humbled herself to ritual cleansing, then ordinary women could hardly object. This story gave church both authority and sacred precedent, though it also reinforced the idea that even holy motherhood carried ritual impurity. At its heart, churching symbolized a tension between gratitude and suspicion. The prayers spoken over the woman were framed as thanksgiving for her survival and the safe birth of her child. Yet woven into the rite was an undercurrent of purification, as if the act of giving birth left her spiritually stained. Blood, sweat, and pain, so essential to life, were interpreted as pollutants to be ritually cleansed before she was welcome again at the altar. Thus, biblical roots gave churching a double edge. On one hand, a recognition of the dangers and sacrifices of motherhood. On the other, a continuation of the ancient idea that women's bodies carried inherent spiritual risk. By grounding the ritual in Scripture, the Church ensured its authority while wrapping the messy reality of childbirth in the language of purity and divine order. While ideas about purity and symbolism gave churching its weight, the ritual itself was grounded in highly choreographed actions. The ceremony typically took place around 40 days after childbirth, though in practice, the timing could vary depending on the health of the mother, the customs of the parish, and local interpretations of canon law. What mattered most was the public act of transition, from seclusion and impurity to blessing and reintegration. The rite usually began outside the church. The mother would wait at the threshold, often veiled or modestly dressed, a visible sign of her humility and temporary separation. The priest would greet her there, echoing the Crively Inet, biblical imagery of exclusion from sacred space. Sometimes he sprinkled at her with holy water, a gesture both purifying and welcoming before leading her inside. In some accounts, she carried a lighted candle, an offering of thanksgiving, and a symbol of Christ's light guiding her return. Once inside, the priest escorted her to the altar. She might kneel or prostrate herself while prayers were spoken over her. The liturgy of churching was not uniform across Europe, but it generally included psalms of thanksgiving, petitions for the health of the mother, and blessings for fertility and protection in the future. One common prayer expressed gratitude that God had delivered her from the perils of childbirth, while another asked that she might walk in newness of life. Offerings often accompanied the ritual. A woman might present a wax candle, symbolizing light and purity, or money to the church, a gift of gratitude for survival. These gifts reinforced the connection between personal blessing and communal obligation, turning the ceremony into both a private thanksgiving and a public contribution. The ceremony concluded with the priest's blessing, after which the woman was considered restored. She could once again receive the Eucharist, attend Mass, and fully participate in the spiritual and social life of her parish. For many, this was a moment of relief, even celebration. but the very structure of the ritual, meeting the mother at the door, leading her back inside, cleansing her with water, emphasized that her body had been suspect, and only the church could remove the stain. In its choreography, churching was both tender and controlling. It offered gratitude and healing, yet framed motherhood as something requiring ritual correction. Every step of the ceremony reminded the woman and her community that giving birth was not simply natural. It was dangerous, polluting, and in need of sanctification. On the surface, the ritual of churching appeared generous, even compassionate. It was framed as a blessing of thanksgiving, a way for the community to rejoice that both mother and child had survived one of life's most dangerous orals. In an age when maternal death was frighteningly common, the very act of returning to church was a triumph. Prayers offered thanks to God for preservation, and the congregation shared in the joy of new life. For some women, churching could feel like a moment of healing, a recognition that their suffering had meaning, that their endurance was worth honoring. Yet woven into this blessing was a darker thread: suspicion. Churching did not only celebrate, it cleansed. The very need for such a rite implied that childbirth, with all its blood and pain, left the mother tainted. Medieval theology often associated bodily fluids with impurity, echoing biblical laws that treated women's bleeding, whether menstruation or childbirth, as contaminating. A mother who had endured labor was therefore seen not simply as exhausted, but as ritually unfit to rejoin the sacred life of the parish until purification had been pronounced. This suspicion reflected deeper cultural anxieties about women's bodies. To men of the medieval church, the female body was paradoxical, essential for sustaining life, yet unpredictable, leaky, and dangerously close to sin. Women were praised as mothers and life-givers, but their generative power was also feared, framed as something that needed careful control. Churching symbolized this tension perfectly, a ritual that simultaneously elevated motherhood as blessed and marked it as contaminating. The mother herself occupied an ambiguous space. She was at once the source of gratitude, thanked for bringing forth new life, and the focus of concern, watched closely for signs of moral or physical impurity. This ambiguity meant that churching could be interpreted very differently depending on perspective. Some women may have embraced it as a welcome moment of thanksgiving. Others may have, "I felt the sting of being treated as unclean." Ultimately, the rite balanced celebration with regulation. It gave thanks for survival, but reminded everyone present that women's bodies, while necessary, were spiritually risky. In this way, churching revealed not just how medieval Europe honored motherhood, but also how it kept it under suspicion, bound by ritual to ensure control over the mysteries of life and birth. Although churching was performed by priests, it was midwives, neighbors, and kin who shaped the experience of mothers between childbirth and the ritual's completion. Childbirth itself was largely women's work. Midwives were the central figures of this world, trusted attendants who knew the dangers of labor firsthand and carried a blend of practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and religious rituals. Their presence lingered even after delivery, as they helped guide mothers through the 40 days of seclusion leading to churching. Midwives were often the first to remind families about the rite. They instructed mothers on when they could safely rejoin the parish, and sometimes accompanied them to the church door, serving as witnesses of survival. Their involvement highlighted the liminal nature of motherhood, between body and soul, between impurity and blessing. Midwives could also prepare small charms, prayers, or blessed objects for the mother to carry during the churching ceremony, reinforcing the sense that this was as much a protective rite as it was a thanksgiving. Neighbors and family members played their part too. The period before churching was one of restricted mobility. Many believed that an unchurched woman should not cook, fetch water, or touch communal goods for fear of passing impurity to the household. As a result, neighbors sometimes provided food or assistance, ensuring that the mother's temporary exclusion did not leave her abandoned. But this generosity came with an edge. Her seclusion also reinforced social boundaries, reminding her and others that she was not yet clean. Community expectations shaped how women approached the ceremony. For some, churching was a joyful re-entry, a moment to parade their survival and the health of their child before watchful neighbors. For others, it was a moment of scrutiny. Gossip could swirl if a woman delayed her churching, or if she seemed reluctant. Such hesitation might spark whispers that she was irreligious, or worse, that she had something to hide. Thus, churching was not just a private blessing, but a communal event, binding families and neighbors into the drama of birth and renewal. Midwives offered continuity, bridging the world of the birthing chamber with the authority of the church, while the community bore witness to a mother's reintegration. In this way, churching was as much about reinforcing social order as about spiritual cleansing. Although churching was a widespread practice throughout medieval Europe, it was far from uniform. The ritual's basic structure, thanksgiving, blessing, and reintegration, was broadly shared. Yet, its details shifted depending on geography, local clergy, and community tradition. These regional variations reveal how flexible the rite could be, adapting to different cultural anxieties about motherhood, purity, and women's roles. In England, the ceremony often retained a strong sense of humility. Mothers arrived, veiled, sometimes barefoot, and